Today we're doing lesson 19, Conflict in the Colonies. What do you think would happen if a new family walked through your door right now, set down their bags, and began rummaging through your cupboards? Or how about if a bulldozer pulled up to the house next to you, smashed the residence, and began setting up tents or a skyscraper? These would be abrupt changes that would startle and even anger you and your family. It would make matters even worse if there were no authorities you could turn to for help, or if those authorities were across the country and you could only write letters and wait for a reply. Chances are very good that disputes would begin to break out. That's very much like what it was like in early colonial days. Ship after ship brought hundreds more pilgrims to the New World, where an estimated 60,000 indigenous Americans already lived. Even as these settlers established themselves, different countries were sending their own people, and with them their ways of living and thinking that were new to everyone else. Despite the peaceful beginnings, conflict did eventually erupt on the shores of New England. Of course, efforts were made to keep the peace. Early settlers traded goods and ideas with the indigenous Americans, as we've learned before. In fact, the first Bible printed in the New World was apparently in the Algonquian language, showing that the settlers were not only trying to bring the gospel with them, but were trying to meet the indigenous Americans on their own terms. Nevertheless, as more settlers arrived, along with those who perhaps did not have the gospel in mind, disputes broke out, and a small spark, blown by a gust of wind, were grown into huge infernos of war. On our Bible break today, take a few minutes to talk about Romans 12:8. Look it up if you need to. Share a time when you had conflict with someone or a time when you chose to live in peace. Then check out these additional verses and discuss what they say about peace. Matthew 5:9, Psalms 34:13-15, and 2 Corinthians 13:11. I'm not going to read those. I'm going to let you guys look them up on your own. It'll do you good to find them in the Bible. The Pequot War of 1636 to 1637. While American history is often told through the stories of the British settlers who established colonies and eventually formed the United States, it is important to remember that people lived on American soil long before it became known as America. It's equally important to know and understand that the British were not the only ones settling in the New World. Can you recall some of the other countries established or trying to establish themselves in America? Along with the British were the French, Dutch, and Spanish, just to name a few. When British colonies first arrived in New England, the Pequot tribe controlled most of the area, and they saw a majority of the trade that occurred between indigenous Americans and the Dutch settlers who had arrived before the English. However, despite the agreed trade between the Pequot and the Dutch, decades of conflict existed between the Pequot and other indigenous peoples over the trade of furs and wampum. You see, the Pequot had been using force to subjugate the other tribes, and the arrival of British settlers only made the conflict that much more challenging. While this struggle for power had been going on for years, one unfortunate event led to the official start of the Pequot War. While out on the Connecticut River, a British trader named John Stone was killed along with his men by the Pequot. The Pequot insisted that they had acted in self-defense, but the British decided they could not let this deed go unpunished. Rather than living peaceably with the Pequot, the British declared war. Over the next years, the Pequot people were attacked many times, not only by the British, but by other local tribes who had been in conflict with the Pequot. Other indigenous Americans claimed to be tired of the Pequot control of the land and trade. Unfortunately, by the time a peace treaty was signed in 1638, over 1,500 Pequot people had either been killed, enslaved, or driven out of their land. King Philip's War of 1675 to 1678. After the Pequot War, several of the New England colonies decided that they needed to band together to protect their homes and continue to settle new lands. They didn't seem to consider that there were the foreigners in the land, or what it felt like to be indigenous peoples to have them expanding into their territory. In 1643, they formed the New England Confederation, and it was this group that fought against the indigenous Americans in King Philip's War. Like the Pequot War, King Philip's War had been a long time in the making, but a single event led to the official start of the battle. Do you remember that the Pilgrims had a peaceful relationship with the Wampanoag people? It was one of the primary reasons they survived those first few winters in America. Well, this peace remained many years, but over time the settlers began to claim more and more land. This caused the tension between the British and the Wampanoag. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that word. The chiefs rose to power, and in 1662, Metacom became the leader of the Wampanoag people. However, like many other indigenous Americans, he decided to take on English name and became known as Philip. The relationship between Philip and the British was tenuous, and one day in 1675, a Christian Wampanoag named John Senesman heard a rumor that Philip was plotting to attack the British. He told the people at Plymouth what he had heard, but they did not listen to him. A short time later, they found his body in an icy pond. He had been murdered by the Wampanoag for exposing their plot. 3 Wampanoag men were arrested for the murder, and a jury of both British and indigenous Americans heard the case. The 3 men were found guilty and were hanged in June of 1675. This hanging made Philip, Chief Metacom, very angry, and he began attacking British colonies. Men and women and children were killed, and homes were destroyed. Because of this violence, the New England Confederation officially declared war against King Philip and his people on September 9th, 1675. As the war went on, other tribes joined with King Philip in the fight against the British. However, some tribes chose to fight alongside of the English soldiers. The war came to an end in 1678 when Metagacom was killed. By the time the fighting ceased, over 3,000 indigenous Americans had been killed, and many more had been sold into slavery. Several tribes almost vanished, and the indigenous Americans of the New England stopped resisting the settling of outsiders on their land. In addition, more than 600 British colonists had lost their lives, and many settlements were completely destroyed. King Philip's War was one of the bloodiest battles in the U.S. history. However, more conflict was right around the corner. So that concludes our lesson 19 for today. And one thing I forgot to tell you, if you want to look up wampum, you can find out what that was in our story that when they traded for wampum.